My name is Greg Hall, and I'm the owner of Khorasan Mills here in Pleasant Grove, Utah. We've been invited to share what we know about healthy grains as an important part of our diet, particularly in relation to the Word of Wisdom, which is the code of health followed by members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. As part of our business, our family works directly with farmers and mills throughout Montana, Idaho, and Utah to source organic and biological grains and flour from farmers who really do care about the way they grow their crops. We then teach people how to use these grains that we'll be discussing in this presentation today. I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I've tried hard to follow the principles of the Word of Wisdom throughout my life. I also grew up on farms where we lived in Idaho when I was younger, and I've seen firsthand how farmers both succeed and also sometimes fail with the crops that they grow from year to year. So we love what farmers do, and we appreciate the risks that they take so that we can all benefit from their labors and insight, especially when farmers grow grains and other crops using clean, natural methods that help to improve the nutrition of the grains that we use and consume every day. We don't always know where our food comes from, but it is possible to know the farmer who grew the grains that you consume. We think this is actually an important part of choosing healthy food, particularly when it comes to grains or flour. We love the farmers that we work with, and so we visit them and we get to know them and we understand the grains that they grow before we bring them here to Utah for sale. In the Word of Wisdom, grains and their various uses are mentioned specifically. As part of this presentation, I'm going to call out grains such as wheat and oats, corn and barley, and many others, and discuss how we can take this spiritual code of health, which is the Word of Wisdom, and apply its principles and promises to the grains that we have available for our own families and communities. When we talk about healthy grains, we discuss different types of grains. Grains like heirloom, and ancient grains such as quinoa and einkorn and spelt, khorasan, which is also known as kamut, and also flax and amaranth and others. Grains that are now available that perhaps weren't as available 10 to 20 years ago. Wheat has also changed since the Word of Wisdom was revealed, and today's wheat is not the same as the wheat that would have been grown in the 1800s or the early 20th century. You'll hear more about this later in the discussion, but just know that one of the promises of living the Word of Wisdom is wisdom itself. The ability to make good and correct choices as we learn about the world and the foods that we choose to consume. In this presentation, we'll discuss many types of grains, and through knowledge and study, you'll come to know what grains are best for you and your family and how they can best benefit your health. As I mentioned previously, the Word of Wisdom is the Lord's code of health followed by members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And in verse 14 of the Word of Wisdom, it says, "All grain is ordained for the use of man and of beasts to be the staff of life." We actually believe this, that grains are the staff of life. Where would we be without bread or cereals? And whether we have food storage or not, most of us have some variety of bread or cereals in our home, and we use these almost daily with the foods that we eat. The verse continues, "Not only for man, but for beasts of the field, and the fowls of heaven, and all wild animals that run or creep on the earth." So the Lord ordains grains for man and beasts, mammals and birds, all of which are the majority of us who creep upon the earth. But it's not just about grains. The Word of Wisdom is about health in its purest form. Foods and drink that are natural and prepared with minimal processing, foods that come from the ground and soil and not necessarily from the shelf. So what grains should we be looking for and consuming? And what healthy grains can you find that you can prepare for your family? I always teach the familiar adage, good, better, and best. And when it comes to grains, we certainly have a number of choices to choose from. I'll come back to this little lesson later in the discussion, but the goal here is to learn what grains are best to use for your own family. So going back to the Word of Wisdom, verse 16 says, "All grain is good for the food of man." And verse 17 then shows Nevertheless, wheat for man, and corn for the ox, and oats for the horse, and rye for the fowls and for swine, and for all beasts of the field, and barley for all useful animals, and for mild drinks, as also other grain. So this verse gets fairly specific about the different grains that we would use for specific animals. But I don't think we need to get caught up in the grains that are mentioned here as they're lined up for each animal or for us, such as wheat for man, corn for the ox, oats for the horse, and rye for the fowls and for swine, and barley for all useful animals. Horses and oxen are certainly useful, and other cattle and farm animals are also useful. So different grains can be used for a variety of reasons and for a number of different animals, including us, or people. So again, as stated in verse 16, all grain is good for the food of man. But what grains have we found that are particularly healthy? And what grains, if any, seem to cause negative health issues? We know through research that heirloom or ancient grains, meaning those that have not been hybridized or crossed, those grains that have remained pure in their original form, can be helpful in the fight against gluten intolerance. These would be grains such as einkorn and emmer, spelt and khorasan or kamut, these varieties of wheat. Also, other gluten-free grains can also be helpful in this regard. If, as the scriptures say, all grain is good for the use of man, then why do some people have negative reactions to wheat and gluten? Does this mean that all wheat is harmful or bad? No. In fact, on the contrary, only some people have issues with gluten. In fact, just a small percentage of people. But for them, that challenge is very real. But for most people, gluten isn't an issue, and even so, we can reduce the impact of gluten intolerance or allergies by choosing grains that are lower in gluten and that are by their very nature more digestible. These ancient varieties of wheat just mentioned fall into this category. We also know that doing things like soaking or fermenting grains in flour help break down gluten even further, such as for sourdough or for sprouted grains. To help reduce the issues with gluten, over the past 10 to 20 years, there's been a resurgence in reestablishing access to heirloom and ancient grains. These grains are typically those that have not been changed, grains that were once grown here in the US or in Europe, but over time have fallen out of favor with farmers because big agriculture started to dominate the market with faster growing, higher yielding varieties of wheat that promise lower costs and higher returns for the farmer, but at the cost we later learned of having lower nutrition, less flavor, and for some people, having intolerance to these hybrid grains, in particular to modern varieties of hybrid red or white wheat. Now we have access to heirloom varieties of wheat like Red Fife and Sonora White or Marquis, and many others, and other ancient varieties of wheat that are higher in protein and lower in gluten, such as einkorn and spelt, khorasan, or sometimes called kamut, emmer, and also barley. These varieties of ancient wheat have higher protein but are lower in gluten, making them more digestible and easier to consume for people who have issues with gluten or wheat. Gluten-free grains can also be good alternatives to wheat. Grains like quinoa and amaranth and flax or millet, buckwheat or teff, these are all good choices for gluten-free recipes, both used as whole grains for soups or side dishes, for example, or milled into flour for breads or quick breads. Now, going back to the lesson of good, better, and best, how does this apply to grains and to wheat? According to the word of wisdom, all grain is good for the food of man, but we know that not all grains are equal. Some are healthy, while some actually cause issues with health. Some are ancient and more pure in their makeup, while others are modern varieties of hybrids that have been specifically bred for particular traits, such as pest or disease resistance, larger kernel size, or increased yield. And unfortunately, nutrition and flavor aren't always included in these traits with modern varieties of wheat. So we look for grains that are first good. In other words, whole grains. grains where we have access to every part of the grain where nothing is removed, either by using the whole grain, the kernel, or by milling the whole kernel into whole grain flour. Whole grains are good. Better would be to use heirloom or ancient grains that have higher protein, lower gluten, or in the case of gluten-free grains, no gluten at all, but still using the whole grain. Heirloom or ancient grains are better because they're generally higher in nutrition. Best would be to use heirloom or ancient grains in a way that maximizes nutrition and digestion. Grains that you could use with a fermentation process, like sourdough, or through sprouting. Both fermenting and sprouting grains help to increase nutrition and digestion a great deal. So fermenting or sprouting grains would be a best use process. When using these grains, it doesn't matter if you use the whole grain as you would for cereals or side dishes, or if it's milled into flour. The purpose is to use the whole healthy grain. Now, since we're on the subject of fermenting, let me just say a couple of things regarding sourdough or sourdough breads. Sourdough has become extremely popular the past few months, but regardless of the reason, sourdough bread and the sourdough fermenting process is just a very healthy choice. And if you choose to move down that path and learn how to use sourdough starters, you'll be choosing a very healthy product to feed your family. Sourdough begins with a starter that contains good bacteria. It's the type of bacteria that is good for our gut. The starter also contains natural yeast that helps the sourdough bread to rise. The combination of bacteria and this yeast help develop the sourdough over a long period of time and that unique sourdough flavor that we like. But it's not all about bread. Think about also sourdough pancakes, waffles, or crackers. You can use the starter in muffins and in other dishes, and there are many good recipes for sourdough. In the end, it's a really great skill to have in your home. So moving on, notice here that as we've talked about whole grains, I didn't even mention white flour as a choice for good, better, or best. This doesn't mean that there isn't a good place for white flour in our diet, but I would recommend that if you use white flour, which many of us do, that it comes from a reliable, clean source where the farmer and the mill work together to produce clean, unenriched, unbleached, unadulterated white flour. From wheat grown organically or biologically, which means naturally, white flour that's produced this way tends to be stronger, it responds better to bread recipes, and it has a better flavor. So having said all of this, how do we use these good grains that we know are better for our diet, even used in the best ways to maximize our nutrition? Here I'll show a few recipes our family likes and some I recommend to those that we work with, each using heirloom or ancient grains for not just good food, but I think really good food, using these whole healthy grains. And we'll also add links to additional recipes and sources for grains at the end of the presentation, so you'll have extra sources to choose from. The first is a kamut spelt bread. This is a yeasted bread that uses kamut and or spelt to make a truly healthy whole grain sandwich bread. This was one of the first recipes we developed using kamut and spelt, using these ancient grains. I love a combination of using these ancient grains together, but kamut and spelt stand well on their own. But I think some of the best breads I've ever made are a combination of using ancient grains together. The flavors blend really well. The next would be rolled kamut cereal. This is a cereal made with ancient grains, raw honey, cinnamon, and other healthy ingredients that I really like. This cereal includes other things like flax and sunflower seeds, coconut oil, just some really natural, healthy ingredients. The flavors blend really well with these ingredients, and the cereal is shelf-stable for months. A third dish would be einkorn pilaf, and this would be similar to a rice side dish. used like rice, but with great tasting herbs and seasonings, using fresh vegetables like garlic and green onions to make a savory, healthy side dish. If you've ever heard of farro, that's what this is. Einkorn or spelt or emmer are also called farro. If you've ever been to a restaurant that serves farro as a side dish or as part of the meal, it would be similar to this. And last but not least, for you who have a sweet tooth, cinnamon rolls using kamut whole grain flour. This is a great tasting whole grain kamut recipe. And one of my goals is to come up with a healthy cinnamon roll, if that's even a thing. But this one I think comes close. You won't believe that these cinnamon rolls are made with 100% whole grain flour, because kamut as a grain has a sweeter taste and a softer texture than most other grains, and so it actually works here. So these are just some fun and healthy recipes that we like to share. Although the Word of Wisdom mentions grains as a healthy food, it doesn't suggest any particular ways to use the grains that we choose to use. This is where we get to choose the different ways that we prepare and use grains as we introduce different types of grains to our family. So a couple of suggestions. Purchase a grain mill. We talked earlier about using whole grains, but truthfully, most grains that we would use would be milled into flour. With whole grain flour, you can make breads and quick breads, pancakes, waffles, muffins, pastries, and everything in between. A grain mill actually gives you control over your grains, from coarsely milled grains for cereals to fine whole grain flour used for breads. I would recommend an electric mill, understanding that if the electricity goes out, that you won't have access to the mill. But hand crank mills don't usually mill fine enough for good bread flour. Bread will usually be more crumbly with flour milled from a hand crank mill. The dough structure won't be as good, and you'll get better bread from finer flour milled with an electric mill. Second, become familiar with a variety of grains. Again, this gives you choice over which grains you ultimately feed your family. Different grains have different flavors, textures, and gluten strength, and different nutrients. It used to be that grains we stored and used would typically be red or white wheat and probably rice. But there are so many choices of grains today that weren't here in years past, from different varieties of wheat to gluten-free grains, grains used for bread and grains used for cereals, grains used for soups and grains used for sprouting, and grains prepared even for Sunday dinner. There are so many grains to choose from. Don't hesitate to familiarize yourself with different types of grains. And so to summarize, when we talk about grains and health and the promises and blessings that we find in the Word of Wisdom, we look for truth. We look at genetics. We look at purity. We look for grains that are healthy because they haven't been changed or modified. Grains that haven't been hybridized or treated with chemicals. Grains that, when analyzed, show a long history of consistency for an abundance of nurturing proteins and minerals, vitamins and micronutrients. We also look for grains that are healthy because of the way they're grown, without the use of commercial pesticides or herbicides or sprays, where healthy soils actually nurture the plant instead of commercial or synthetic fertilizers being sprayed on the plant itself, which in turn adds little or no value back to the soils. In the end, we want to find and use good, clean, healthy grains. So what is the Word of Wisdom then? It is the Lord's law of health, and it is as true today as it was almost 200 years ago when the Lord revealed the Word of Wisdom to Joseph Smith. And we're still learning today how our food, and in this case, how grains in particular, help us to realize these promised blessings. Blessings of health in the navel and marrow to the bones, blessings of wisdom, knowledge, and physical and spiritual strength. I'm going to conclude the presentation today with a reference to a talk given by Elder Boyd K. Packer back in 1996, where he addressed the Word of Wisdom, what it is, how it works, how we should approach living the word of wisdom relating to what we should or should not consume, and also the blessings that come from living this great commandment of health. So thanks for spending some time with us today, and just know that you have access to grains that are truly healthy and clean, grains that fit the spirit of the word of wisdom, that are grown by farmers who are stewards of the soil, grains from farmers who truly care about the way their crops are grown. So from the farm and the farmer to our own tables, we can help you get started. Thanks again.